his name.
Hello lovelies, I'm terrible at pimping my stuff, so here I am, pimping my stuff. Please like, subscribe, and most important of all, share, so that people can discover me and all the wonders that I offer.
But the priority, as far as I'm concerned, is no longer is to make sure we pass on as much as we can to them. One, because I don't think we'll have it anyway.
No.
Because of the cost of care. And two, because I think we've worked hard. We deserve to spend that money on ourselves.
There's a podcast and a YouTube show called Trigonometry. And recently they got into the UK housing crisis, which is a genuine, real, big issue. And they got viciously trolled by right-wingers because they have refused to have people like Black Pigeon Speaks onto the cast to interview them and talk to them because they don't think that they have anything useful to say. Partly that's just down to the fact that in the show they try to really talk to experts, albeit controversial ones, rather than just demagogues and YouTube talking heads, unless there's some other reason why it's a good idea to talk to them. This has incensed the far right, so they viciously trolled and spammed the whole interview. But it was a very interesting interview, and I had a lot of fun counter-trolling the trolls in the comments. But it's an interesting subject in and of itself. The reasons for the UK housing crisis are a lot more complicated than the racists would have you believe. To the far right, the answer's simple. It's immigration. But that answer is indeed simple, like the people who are proposing it. It's a far more complicated issue, and to really understand it, you have to understand the UK's culture of home ownership, Thatcher's right to buy scheme from the 1980s, the demographic boomer bulge, and then we can circle back around to immigration once we have that full context in place. So the UK has a really strong culture of home ownership. This has been a long tradition in the UK and has only really been undermined since the 1980s. The idea is that you are safe and secure if you have a house, if you own it. It's a sign that you've made it. It's a sign of adulthood. It's the place you're going to raise your family. It's an investment, and it's something you can pass on to your children. So it's a sign of security and safety, far more so than in a lot of countries where renting is the norm throughout your life. In the UK, the culture is own a home. As I say, this has been undermined a bit. We'll get into some of the reasons why. But a big part of it is refinancing. So as people get older, they retire. People are living longer. Yeah, wonderful, good thing. But they're in retirement for longer. Their pension has to last longer. Their savings have to last longer. And often it doesn't. Or people have big expectations of what they want to do in their retirement that require a lot more money than they have managed to save or that their pension income provides them. The wonderful solution to this, as we saw in the intro, is refinancing. So you will essentially sell your house to a bank and rent it off them for a lump sum of money that you can then spend on your retirement, traveling to Cancun or Thailand or whatever else it is that you really wanted to do. So there's that aspect. There's also an undermining aspect coming from the cost of social care. There simply aren't enough public spaces for the amount of people getting dementia and other long-term frailties. Elder care is a huge problem, which means you have to go private, which means to finance that, to put Granny in a home where she will hopefully be taken care of, she needs to sell the family house to raise the hundreds of thousands of pounds that it will cost to have her cared for until the end of her life. So that's undermined that. So part of the housing crisis here is that family homes is not so much of a thing anymore. You can't guarantee that you're going to inherit. And a lot of houses are being sold off, essentially, to finance Playboy retirements. Okay, I'm being a little bit unfair there, but you can see the problem. There's no longer that multi-generational home ownership. That's part of the problem. The right to buy scheme is old news, but it hasn't really changed. In the 1980s, the Conservatives, sort of appealing to the strivers and the aspirational types, decided that they would make it possible, even compulsory, upon the councils at any rate, that you could buy your council house. Okay. Council houses, it's social housing. So if you can't get a house, you go on a list, and then as a council house becomes available, you will be assigned to it. You can move in. Rent's cheap. Council takes responsibility for a large amount of the upkeep and so on, but you're paying revenue into the council and you're living there. It's the next best thing to owning a place if you can't afford it. So Thatcher undermined that by saying that you had the right to buy the council house that you were living in, and it would tend to be cheaper than a lot of other housing. The idea was that this would get you on the housing ladder. It would give you that sense of security and safety. It would make you feel part of the wider society in a financial sense. It would make you more accomplished and so forth. In theory, a good idea. The only problem is that it took so much social housing out of circulation, meaning that there wasn't enough to meet the demand. And that's helped drive up our homelessness and other issues. And you would think it wouldn't be so bad. After all, if someone buys the council house from the council, then the proceeds, the money, goes to the council, and it's cheaper to build houses, so they can use that money to build more social housing and put it back into the system. So you would think. It doesn't work like that. To start with, councils only get 75% of the proceeds from the sale of a house. Of that money, only 1/3 can be spent on building new homes. And councils have other demands on their money. Government grants? Well, there were government grants to local councils coming from central government to enable them to buy and build more social housing, but austerity has put paid to that. Those grants have been repeatedly slashed, so that's not really there in any effective sense anymore. Okay. Well, you're going to make a profit on it, so can't councils borrow money to build housing? And that way they've got social housing supply, and if people buy it, then they've got more money to build more social housing. So it seems like a sound investment, right? Nope. Council borrowing is capped, and as we just covered, they have lots of other demands on their money. So if they're going to borrow, it's not necessarily going to go on social housing and other long-term issues. It's going to go on putting out fires. Now, if you don't have the capacity, you can't even update existing homes or demolish decrepit homes in order to build new ones upon it, because where are all those people going to live while you do it? This also has huge problems when it comes to council money anyway, because a huge amount is being spent on housing support. So a lot of people who are renting, various situations, long-term unemployment, illness, that sort of thing, they need housing support money, and they get it. But that costs a huge amount, especially since so many of them are privately renting instead of publicly renting, which means that money is leaving government revenue and going into the private sector, and thereby not being reinvested or going to support local services and so on in any case. So that's a huge problem. Now, the other big problem is, so when a developer applies for planning permission to build a new council estate or an apartment block or whatever else the case might be, quite often there are demands from the local council that they will kind of ease the planning restrictions and so on a little bit if they build a certain percentage of affordable housing. That sounds great, right? There's cheaper homes, things people can actually afford. Unfortunately, in a rather Orwellian turn of events, the government has defined affordable as 80% of market rate. Now, take my house. It's just a small bungalow. I was extremely lucky to inherit it in the current climate. That's worth getting on for £500,000 due to the area and so on. Can you think of anyone earning £20,000 to £30,000 a year, even £40,000 a year, even as a couple doubling that income, who could really realistically afford to take out a mortgage on something worth that much let alone 80% of that much, yeah, that's not really a meaningful difference at that kind of rate. And it's not a big house. It's just in a nice area. But it helps demonstrate how grotesquely inflated housing prices are. And part of that is artificial because the house builders aren't building enough housing because they want to keep the prices high because that's where the profit is. So hopefully there you can see how right to buy and various other legislation around that has caused a huge cascade of problems, particularly where it interfaces with the public sector. So the boomers then. Right. The baby boomers, it's the generation or generations from 1947 to 1965. So the youngest boomers are about 55 years of age. So we've got about 10 more years with boomers continuing to move into retirement. And then we've got 20, 30, 40 more years until they all die off. Which sounds harsh, but that's how long there's going to be a squeeze, because there is this massive bulge in demographics that has slowly moved up through the generations. That puts a huge degree of strain on things, particularly thanks to fertility rates. So in 2016, I believe, for the first time ever, the fertility rate was higher in people over 40 than in the under 20s. What that suggests to me is that younger people just don't feel safe and secure and in a good place to be having children, raising children, until they're settled, secure, they've got a career, all of those kind of things in their 40s. Yeah, it says a lot about the effectiveness of fertility treatments, but I also think it says a huge amount about just how insecure a lot of people feel, how economically precarious a lot of people feel. So the fertility rate, the amount of births per couple, basically, peaked at about 2.93 in 1964. That was the peak of the baby boom. And today, though it's been even lower, it's about 1.8. Now, replacement level is just over 2 because, 2 replaces the mother and the father. You need a little bit more because people do die unnaturally before reaching breeding age and so on, or before having kids. So we're below replacement levels. So we have this huge bulge in the older people, and we have a narrowing in younger people. And as the older cohort ages out, they're no longer economically active, at least not so much. So they're taking a lot of revenue with them, taxation with them. And as we covered earlier, they're also taking their housing with them without necessarily passing it on to their kids or leaving much in the way of money or anything else to their kids. Plus, that older cohort, as it reaches retirement and then an elderly state of decrepitude with dementia and other issues, because people are living longer, remember, they're also putting huge demands on medicine and social care. There aren't enough workers, there's not enough population, and as a consequence, there's not enough revenue to really take care of that elderly cohort just within our own population. And that brings us finally around back to the issue that made all this interesting or worth making a video on at any rate. Immigration and racism. So, as I said, it's very simple to point the finger at immigration, but you'd have to be simple to think that it's that simple. As we've covered, the birth rate isn't enough. We have this big bulge of aging people, and we have compensated to a degree with immigration. Now, immigrants, contrary to what a lot of people might tell you, do not put a drain on the economy if we look at it overall. Non-EU migrants, they're about break-even to 1.1 times what they're paid by the state, so they're worth, in terms of revenue, in terms of taxation, without even taking into account the economic activity they contribute directly through work to the private sphere, and they're worth the same as or slightly more than what's paid out to them in terms of rental assistance, unemployment benefit, all of that kind of stuff. That's non-EU migrants. EU migrants, the ones we're going to see a great deal less of lately, are worth somewhere between 1.3 to 1.6 times what goes out to them from the state. And they're the ones we're not going to see as many of. You would think that the racists would prefer to have more EU migration than non-EU migration, even without looking at the economics, because, they're scared of brown and black and yellow people. And the economic reality is that we're going to have to make up these numbers from somewhere. And that means it's likely to be a big increase in non-EU migration, which is likely to primarily come from Africa and the Middle East, the very areas that you would think would concern the racists even more. It's like they didn't think this through, isn't it? This is of particular applicability to the topics we've covered, the aging population and housing, because the care sector and the NHS are huge employers of immigrant labour. 13% of NHS staff are immigrants. I think it's about half and half between non-EU and EU. So if you're concerned about the healthcare system being overwhelmed or overloaded with people, think how much worse it's going to be with 10% less staff, right? That's cleaners, so MRSA becomes more of a problem. That's doctors, that's nurses, that's surgeons, that's specialists. It's everything. Then if we look to care homes, which are increasingly important, social care for the elderly, about 16% of social care workers are immigrants. Do I need to spell out what the problem is here? Those numbers are just going to have to be made up from somewhere, and it's going to have to be immigration. Now, Priti Patel, the Home Secretary, at least at the time of recording, because she's in trouble for bullying people in her department, she suggested that there are 8.5 million economically inactive workers in the UK. It's technically correct, but not actually correct. Of that 8.5 million, 2 million people are students. 2 million people are long-term ill or disabled. 2 million are filling in the gaps in the care system by taking care of families because they can't get childcare, or taking care of people who are disabled or elderly so that they don't have to go into social or private care. About 1 million people took early retirement. About 150,000 have a short-term illness that's going to keep them out from being able to work anytime soon. And there's about 1 million people in a sort of miscellaneous bubble. Don't know exactly what's going on there. Maybe they're not allowed to work. Who knows? It's just misc. So that leaves only around 250,000 people technically free to work. But do you really want Darren, who's been unemployed for 2 years, has no skills, no GCSEs or whatever, being forced to look after your elderly relatives or have his unemployment benefit slashed? Yeah, he's not going to care. He's not going to have the skills. He's not going to want to do a good job or bother to do a good job. That's the kind of people that Priti Patel wants to put into doing things. It's just not going to work. To make things even worse, under the government's proposed points-based immigration system, care sector work is classified as unskilled. Now, there are genuine problems in and around immigration. The revenue that they produce, whether it's to the government or to the bosses, is just not really being reinvested. So even though they're providing work within the care sector and the health sector and many others, even though they're doing that, and even though they're producing a lot of taxation revenue, it's not being put back into healthcare or social care or education. It's just not being done. So when people blame immigrants for the waiting periods to get an operation or to see a doctor, or overly huge class sizes or whatever else, it's understandable why they would blame immigrants, because that's what they kind of see with their eyes. But the real blame should be laid at the feet of austerity and the fact that the revenue that they're producing is not being ploughed back in where it needs to be. So it's true, technically, to say that immigrants are putting a strain on our housing, on our healthcare, on our education, and various other things. But at the same time, they're contributing a huge amount to those areas. And they're contributing a huge amount of revenue, which in any fair world would be ploughed back into these things. But it's more convenient for certain people to allow the blame to be laid at the feet of immigration rather than austerity. The sheer bald fact of the matter is that you, as a white middle class or lower class working class person, are likely to have a lot more in common with a black middle class or working class, or you're far more likely to have a lot in common with them than you are with Jacob Rees-Mogg, quite frankly. We need class consciousness, not race consciousness. Immigrant and native populations alike should be united in demanding that the government meet the needs of their communities. That's where the blame lies. But it's easy to blame the other. It's been easy to blame the EU for the UK's own internal problems. It's been easy to blame immigrants for the policy choices that our government has made. But there are other problems. We are so hypersensitive to the threat of racism and not wanting to give oxygen to racists while at the same time doing this kind of sly stepping aside and letting the blame go where it shouldn't. But we're so sensitive about it that the crimes that we're all well aware of, the abuse circles, gangs, they went on unchallenged for such a long time. In part because we're so hypersensitive to the problem of racism. It would have been better, all things considered, to lance the boil at the time. But people were so worried, so concerned about being perceived as racist or of giving oxygen to racists that they didn't deal with it. And now it's come out, it looks a lot worse. And has fed racism a lot more than dealing with it at the time would have done. I mean, when you look at the statistics, it's not that huge a problem, but it should have been nipped in the bud earlier. It doesn't say anything about the majority of Muslims or South Asians or anything else, these incidents, any more than the prevalence of, white serial killers says anything about white people or Christians as a whole. But we didn't deal with it. It's ironic that a fear of being seen as racist or helping racists has done exactly that. But let's not end on a downer. What are the solutions? If you've been listening and paying attention, then I think the solutions seem obvious, right? End the right to buy scheme. Give renters more rights. Maintain immigration, even though that'll be less helpful now, but take the money that you gain from immigration and earmark it for reinvestment in the social fabric, in hospitals, in schools, in social care homes, the very things that are being strained. Provide for social care through taxation, and we're all going to have to pay a bit more tax. But do we want to live in a society that just leaves its elderly to rot, or do we want to take care of them? Similarly with the NHS, are we all willing to pay a little bit more tax to maintain a free at the point of use NHS for everyone that we can all continue to be proud of? I think most people are willing to pay a little bit more there. After all, the value is through the roof. Are any of these solutions likely to happen anytime soon? No. The fact is, despite promises to the contrary, Johnson's government is doubling down on austerity by about another 5%. And rather than looking after the new seats that they've won up north, they're channeling funds from the north down to the south to try and secure their base. Like so many things, we know what needs to be done. It's there on paper, the experts know, the statistics point to it, but there just isn't the political will. Either to do it, for ideological reasons, or to educate the public on why it's the right thing to do, when they have different ideas, uninformed as they might be. Zhang.
Sure, you could play one of those hoity-toity horror games where the most horrifying thing that happens is someone wearing a corset who really shouldn't. Or you could grind a zombie's face into a belt sander.